See if I can do this without breaking it. You guys hear me okay in the microphone?
Yes, sir.
So when I first, I tried to do this last year, and I actually lost my parents and just had a lot of stuff happen that I couldn't make it. And then I lined it up this year. I'm speaking to the Noonan Historical Society tomorrow at the historic courthouse. And that's a ticketed event because I'm providing a meal and everything. I'm not cooking. I hired a caterer. But I didn't know when I set all this up back in the spring that I was going to be appointed by the president in July. So I ended up moving to Washington, D.C. in August and have been in the administration now for about 4 weeks. So I was like, I got to figure out how I'm going to get books to Senoia. And I had a lady in Union that was a tremendous help, Renee Carl. But if I had known I was going to get appointed, I probably wouldn't have agreed to sit because it was really hard to get here. And the modern world still amazes me. This morning I was speaking at the U.S. Capitol to the congressman. So 11 o'clock I was speaking at the U.S. Capitol, and now I'm here. So if I accidentally start talking about nuclear power, remind me that I'm in Senoia, not in the Capitol. So how many people in the room read the Margaret Barnes book, Murder in Coweta County? Quite a few. Okay. How many didn't read the book or did both and saw the movie too? Okay. So you may be aware of this. Most people aren't. Margaret Barnes wrote a novel, which is what I wrote. Fiction based on actual events. A lot of Georgians think that Margaret Barnes' book was a nonfiction telling of the story. It was not. She fictionalized parts of it just like I did. Mostly she did a great job. But she set up an appointment to interview my grandfather, who was intimately involved in the investigation, and she never came. So I don't know all the story behind that. So where you'll see it, and we'll get into it a little bit, where my story really differs from hers is the search for the body. She had a lot of stuff right. She's got the search for the body completely wrong. So we can get into that a little bit. My grandfather, C.E. Miller, grew up in northern Florida outside of Gainesville, a little town called Evanston, which is still a very cool place to visit. Have you ever heard the John Anderson song, Blow, Blow, Seminole Wind? It says blow all the way up to Micanopy. So Evanston is near Micanopy. And Micanopy, Cross Creek, Evanston. Evanston, even today, is like a little place lost in time. The general store that was in service when my grandfather was a little boy is still in service today. Same building. It's the oldest continuously operating store in the United States of America. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. So he grew up there in a single parent home with 5 sisters. And when he was 6, he was sent out to hunt, not for sport or recreation, for survival, because they needed the meat. His family grew vegetables and sold them. That's how they supported themselves. But they didn't have a lot of livestock. They had a few chickens and a couple of pigs, but they needed game to survive. So he became an outstanding navigator in the woods, an outstanding marksman, and just a great tracker. So he actually loved baseball, and he played in kind of the precursor to the Florida Grapefruit League as a first baseman. So he moved to Atlanta in 1920 to try to make it onto the Atlanta Crackers. Have y'all heard of the Atlanta Crackers? And he wasn't a good enough hitter. So he ended up trying to find work in Atlanta, and he was selling dental instruments. And then he found out that the state of Georgia would pay him to go hunt moonshiners. And that was right up his alley. So he really started as a revenuer in the very late 20s, early 30s. And he did that job for a little over 15 years until he ran crossways with Governor Gene Talmadge, which is going to be my sequel that I'm working on now, which is going to be called Moonshine and the Three Governors, which is interaction with Governor Talmadge. And are y'all aware of the Georgia Three Governors controversy? Yeah. So he got kind of wrapped up in that. It's a great story. I'm working on it now. But he grew up much closer to a pioneer child than a modern day person. The woods in the South were huge back then. They went for miles and miles and miles, especially in North Florida where it was all swamps. He and I were watching a nature program when I got to be a grown man. I was probably in my early 20s, and he and I were very close. And it was on alligators in Florida and how they were actually becoming a problem at that time. There were so many of them. So they were showing how rough alligators could be and aggressive. And I turned to my grandfather and I said, Pop, didn't you tell me you used to chase after your coonhounds all night with a lantern when you were little in Florida? And he said, Oh, yeah, almost every night. And I said, Did you have like snake boots or something? And he said, Snake boots? Snake boots? Boy, I didn't even own a pair of shoes till I was 14 years old. And I said, Well, weren't you afraid of snakes and alligators? He goes, Well, no, I never thought about it. And he said, I guess this next part is really profound. He says, I guess I should have been, but I was about half wild. He wasn't exaggerating. He was about half wild. So when he got to be a revenue agent, he was right at home. Um, I was reading the book, Murder in Coweta County, and I was at his house. Somebody had given it to him, and he read it. He didn't like it. There were several things he didn't like about it. He felt like were inaccurate. And I came in there, and he saw me reading it in his den, and he kind of popped me on the arm, and he said, Boy, what are you reading that crap for? And I said, Pop, this is awesome. You're in this book. And he is in it, just two small places. And he said, Oh, them people don't know nothing. He said, You come back here in my room. So I went back in his room, and he got out a green metal strongbox, and he riffled through a bunch of papers. Most of the papers that were in that strongbox, when he turned 93, he died just a few months later, he burned most of it. And I think he did it to protect informants. And I'll tell you why I think that later. So he riffled through the papers, and he pulled out a piece of looked like very nice lady stationery with like little flowers on the corners. It was written in pencil. And it said, Agent Miller, it is urgent that we meet. Meet me at my barn at midnight. Come alone. Signed, John Wallace. So that's why my cover art is what it is. That artwork that I had done by an artist represents the midnight meeting between John Wallace and my grandfather. The meeting is one of the most historically accurate chapters in my book, because not only do I have my grandfather's account of it, I later obtained a copy of a letter written by John Wallace where he talks about it extensively. And almost even the dialogue that the two of them spoke was identical to the way my grandfather told me and the way I remembered it. So Wallace actually corroborated my grandfather's version of those events. That meeting took place a full year before Wilson Turner was killed. So my grandfather was really involved in investigating Wilson Turner and John Wallace for over a year before Sheriff Potts and the other folks even got involved in any of it. So he knew Wallace, he knew Turner. He had arrested Wallace in 38, and Wallace did a year for it in the Tower in Atlanta, which is no longer there. It was a prison in Atlanta. He arrested Wilson Turner in 45, and some of that is talked about in my book. My mother was a little girl the night that he went to that midnight meeting, and she remembered, she passed away sadly last year, but holding on to his leg and crying and begging him not to go. And my grandmother, who's Rose in the book, was begging him not to go because they were afraid Wallace was going to kill him. But I'll fast forward for a minute. When I was researching this book, well, let me tell it this way. In that strongbox, which I now have in my home, in my writing office, the papers that survived the fire, that he burned some stuff, there was one commendation in there from the Georgia governor, Milt Thompson. Milt Thompson was one of the three Georgia governors in the three governors controversy. He had been lieutenant governor. The commendation said, This is to commend you for rounding up the Upson County liquor gang in Thomaston. Well, he had never talked to me about a liquor gang. My grandfather was really humble, and I had to just pull stuff out of him. So I go to the Upson County Historical Society. I was living in Kentucky, but I was researching over the phone. And I talked to a lady there named Penny Cliff. She's from London, actually, London, England. Has an English accent. But I said, Have you ever heard of the Upson County Liquor Gang? She said, No, let me do some digging. So she looked into it for 3 or 4 weeks. She said, nobody here knows anything about the Upson County Liquor Gang. We can't find anything on it in our archives. She said, the only thing I have is two gentlemen came and spoke to our historical society 10 or 15 years ago. So that would have been about 1990. And she said, I don't have their contact information. I don't know where they are. All I have is their names. One of them was a revenue agent and one of them was a moonshiner. Well, I didn't know if either one of them would have known my grandfather, but I determined I was going to find both of them, and I did. And I sat with each of them for about 3 hours. The moonshiner I found in a nursing home in Panama City Beach, Florida. I found his son first. His son told me that he was a retired Alaska State Trooper. Keep that in mind. I'll come back to it. So I went and interviewed this old gentleman. He was 93 when I interviewed him, and his memory was as good as anybody in here's. And I said, did you ever know a revenue agent named C.E. Miller? And this is a direct quote. He said, I didn't just know that son of a bitch. He's the one that took me to jail. So I was thrilled because I didn't care if he loved him or hated him. If he knew him, then he was going to be a gold mine of information, and he was. We talked for a long, long time. And the last thing he told me has stayed with me the rest of my life. I researched this book in 2014 and 15. He said, son, I want you to understand something about your grandpa. He said, I served in the infantry in World War II, and your grandfather is the only man I ever met in my life who I would call completely fearless. He said, you got to understand, we were deep in the woods. We were miles from any roads with our stills, and we all had a gun, and we would have shot your grandpa as soon as looked at him. But he said, your grandfather was fearless, and he was relentless, and he shut down the liquor business in the western part of Georgia. And I got chill bumps. I even telling you that now because as I said, my grandfather was humble, and he would always downplay what he had done. So that's the Upson County Liquor Gang. So half my book is about the John Wallace case, and half of it is about the Upson County Liquor Gang. Now here's where I was able to use fiction in a fun and creative way. Those two cases actually happened 2 years apart. Upson County Liquor Gang was 46. Wallace was closer to 48. I put them together in the same summer of 46 because that way the story moves really fast. This young lady right here will tell you it moves fast. She said she couldn't put it down. So, and so many people all around the country have contacted me and said that same thing. I actually got contacted by a retired Green Beret colonel who lives in Pine Mountain now, who's a fascinating man in his own right. I didn't know him, but his daughter had given him the book, and I had an author business card in there, so my phone number was in there. And he called me out of the blue, and he said, sir, is this the author Chris Gates? I said, yes. I didn't know who it was. And he goes, sir, my name is, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name right now, but he's retired Colonel so-and-so. He said, sir, my daughter gave me your book, Moonshine Over Georgia. I did not want the book. I did not want to read the book, but I decided to pick it up one Saturday and thumb through it and just see what it was about. Sir, I read 150 pages in one sitting. I could not put it down. The book is fantastic. So that was a great compliment coming from a guy who's had his life experiences. So we talked about Moonshine and Three Governors. So the other guy I interviewed was a revenue agent. So not only did I have all my grandfather's stories for years, I spent hundreds of hours with my grandfather, and he would occasionally tell me about, he loved to talk about the tracking. He loved to talk about how he found a particular still. One very accurate chapter in my book is where my grandfather busted an illegal poker game. We were going somewhere, and I wish I could remember where it was, which county, because he had about 6 counties in his jurisdiction. And it was an old country store. And he pulled over. He was driving a 66 Oldsmobile Delta 88, which I later drove to college. And he said, I was about 13 or 14 then. He said, son, you see that building, that store? I said, yes, sir. He said, you see that stairwell going up the side of it? I said, yes, sir. He said, biggest bust of my career was right up the top of those stairs. So that's all in the book. I'm not going to tell you too much because I don't want to spoil it for you. But Jim Griggs was a moonshiner. But then I also interviewed a revenue agent. And I said, did you know Agent C.E. Miller? I know you were a revenue agent in that same era. And he said, I didn't just know him. He said, your grandfather was my training officer. So that was 2 living witnesses who knew my grandfather very well and worked with him in the field. And you could never replace that. No matter how much archival research you do, a living witness is so invaluable. And they both gave me a lot of information that I put into the book. And I'll finish tonight with a story that about a moonshine raid that revenue agent told me about. It's actually pretty funny. So in the Wallace case, Wallace wanted this midnight meeting. And I can tell you a little bit about it without spoiling the book. The midnight meeting is in chapter 4, so it's early in the book. So my grandfather pulls up to his barn, and if you've been to Wallace's place, I've been there many, many times now. It's in the middle of nowhere in 2025. It was really remote in 1948. So he pulls up to the barn. Wallace got in the car with him, and he starts trying to make small talk. For my grandfather always said it was a little bit odd. Wallace liked my grandfather, and my grandfather didn't like him because he knew some of his history. He said, try to make small talk, and my grandfather said, John, he said, I'll tell you what, I appreciate you. Just get down to business. He said, my wife's worried. What do you want? And Wallace says, I want you to run Wilson Turner out of the state of Georgia. And my grandfather got angry because he knew that Sheriff Hardy Collier was corrupt. Hardy Collier, the sheriff, was my grandmother's cousin. So they knew him from family events and stuff. Neither one of them liked him. He was kind of a blowhard. And the movie depicted him to be a weakling. He was actually a big barrel-chested guy. But and he always treated my grandfather like the junior officer, and my grandfather resented that. So anyway, he resented that Wallace asked him to do something at his bidding as though he were corrupt. And he said, Wallace, I don't run people out of the state of Georgia on your say-so. I'm more in the business of making liquor cases against them. And Wallace says, well, do that then. He said, he's making liquor on my property without my permission. And my grandfather called him out. Nobody talked to Wallace like this, but he said, Wallace, you're a liar. He said, he's not making liquor without your permission. He's making liquor as your employee. And he said, I'm going to find your still eventually. Wallace was a genius on how he hid the still, and that's in the book too. He said, and I'm going to put you both in the penitentiary. So Wallace just got furious. You just didn't confront John Wallace like that, especially on his own property. And my grandfather said he just started shaking, and then he got out of the car. And that was the end of my grandfather's story. Now, I wrote the book that way, and it's still that way in the book because it's a really good dramatic story. But what I didn't know until after the book was published, I got information from the archives that wasn't the end of the encounter. So when I wrote the book, when you get to chapter 1, you'll see I was trying to think, all right, I don't want to just retell murder in Coweta County. So what if I have my grandfather have a relationship with Turner? And then when Turner goes missing for a period of time, my grandfather feels guilt-ridden. And so he's frantically looking for Turner. So I decided to have my grandfather find Turner at a small still. I was just going to make this part up. And try to tell Turner, I want to arrest you if you'll be an informant against your boss, John Wallace. And then I had Turner turn him down. So I had never talked to my grandfather about that. I didn't really think that really happened, but I thought it would make great drama. So I went down to the area. My mother-in-law actually owns land in Stovall. So I went to her property. I hunt there a lot of times in the spring for turkey season. So I did some hunting, but I also started looking around. Where do I want to put this pretend still that I'm going to make up? And I got on Google Earth and all this stuff, and I finally found White Sulphur Spring. And I love that name. That's a very literary name. So I put this imaginary still on White Sulphur Spring. Write the book that way. I've left it that way because it's a really great way to tell the story. But after the book was published, I get these documents of my grandfather's testimony. And the district attorney is questioning my grandfather. And he said, what happened after Wallace got out of the car and was angry? He said, he finally walked back to my car and he says, well, if you won't arrest him on my say-so or run him out of the state on my say-so, I'll take you and show you where he's got a small still on his own. Well, I started getting chill bumps. I had already written my book. I didn't know that really happened. And my grandfather says, okay, let's go. So it was already midnight. And now he's got a killer getting in his car with him, and they're going to go right off down the road in Stovall looking for Turner. So and I took my grandfather there, by the way, when he was 92 and had him go show me a bunch of stuff. And it had changed a lot. All the roads were paved, and he said there were no paved roads back here back then. So they go down this dirt road. They start looking for Turner, and I'm just going to do it like it appeared in the testimony. The DA says, "Now you saw Turner coming out of the logging road from where his still was in his new truck, didn't you?" My grandfather said, "Yes, sir." He said, "And what did you do?" He said, "I turned to Wallace and I said, 'Man, I wish you weren't in this car with me. I'd love to run him.'" Now the revenuers, and I knew my grandfather's partner, Doc Cook, too, another great name that you couldn't make up a name that good. And they would talk to each other about the old days. So they used the term run him in a number of different ways. Run him could mean chase a guy on foot. Run him could mean chase him in your car, but it could also mean run him to jail. If you arrested him, then you ran him. And the other cool thing that my grandfather always said was if he had to draw his firearm, he called it pull. If I had to pull on a man, I hated to pull on a man, that kind of stuff. So he said, I told Wallace I'd love to run him. And Wallace says, well, if you want to chase him, just put me out. So he puts John Wallace out on the side of the road and takes off in a high-speed chase after Turner. This is all really happening. So the DA says, and you were able to overtake Turner's truck and run him into a ditch, weren't you? My grandfather said, yes, sir. And he says, now when Turner came out of that truck, he was fighting mad, wasn't he? And my grandfather said, yes, sir, he was pretty mad. And he said, and he gave you what for, didn't he? And my grandfather says, he tried to, he did not succeed. And he said he said a few words. That was about the end of it. And he said, at that time, you tried to get Turner to become your informant, didn't you? And my grandfather said, yes, sir, I did. Well, I just about dropped the transcript. I had already written my book that way. I didn't know that he really tried to get Turner to be his informant. So he says, now this still that Turner had, where was it located? And my grandfather said, on White Sulphur Spring. So I don't believe in communicating with the dead, but somehow my grandfather told me that. The still that you'll read about, John Walsh's actual still, I got an anonymous message from Phoenix, Arizona. And it said, I've read your book. Would you please call this number? I'm related to John Wallace. The person made me promise not to say how they're related, so I won't. But I did call them. And at first I thought it was a crackpot. I thought somebody was just messing with me. But they knew so much about the case that I knew they were legit. And the person said, I've got one question for you. How did you know where John Wallace hid his still? That's never been made public. And I said, I didn't know. I just made it up. And they said, well, you made it up really good because that's exactly where it was. And that's exactly how he hid it. So again, I don't know if my grandfather was sending me telepathic messages when I wrote this or not. So I want to do a reading. And this, again, is why I really wanted to do fiction. Because people ask me all the time, you knew so much about the case, you spent so many hours with your grandfather, you did so much research. Why didn't you just write a nonfiction book? Because I wanted to capture the heart. And there's a meeting that I'm going to read to you about that did happen. So the murder was at the Sunset Tourist Camp truck stop in Moreland, Georgia. You're all aware of that, right? Well, my grandfather heard about it on his radio. They had just gotten radios in their cars like the year before. It was a fairly new technology back then. And he heard about an assault at the Sunset truck stop on his radio. And he was far away. I think he was in Meriwether County, pretty close to Talbot County, working on another case. But he had been looking at that part about him frantically looking for Turner. That did actually happen. He didn't know that Collier had arrested him and he had him in the Greenville jail. He never thought to look there. It was almost too obvious. And so he goes racing to the Sunset truck stop, and he's got to go across 2 counties. So he's late getting there. So by the time he gets there, Sheriff Potts has already confiscated the Turner's truck and done fingerprints, done whatever investigating they were going to do on site. So when he got there, the only person left there was Steve Smith, who owned, I don't know if he owned it or was a cook there. I think he owned it. So what I'm about to read you is the conversation. Now, all I know that was really said between them is a very key piece of evidence that we'll talk about at the end of this chapter. What I didn't know was all the actual dialogue. I had to fictionalize that part, and that's why I love fiction. Here's how I describe my writing. My grandfather left, the whole story is a 15,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. My grandfather gave me 5,000 pieces. My research gave me another 5,000 pieces, and I filled in the other 5,000 with fiction so that you get a tapestry and a full picture. So this chapter I'm about to read is a metaphor for the whole book. It's why I chose this chapter. I've written 5 books now. I think this is the best 5 pages I've ever written because I wanted to capture the heart of this story. And it's really not just a story about an old murder case. It's a story about the loss of innocence. And it's also a story about calling. My grandfather felt a calling to stamp out moonshine in his community. And I'll tell you some more about that in a minute. And so I have been down here to this part of Georgia probably 5 or 6 times to speak about the book. Every single time I've made some kind of connection. A lot of times the people will get in touch with me later, but I've had people come up to me crying and thank me for writing the book. This happened 80 years ago. And there was something there were a lot of murders. I'm sure other people got murdered in 1948 in this area. But there was something about this case that it really caught people's heart. I've had people sob on my shoulder, elderly people who knew some of the players that were involved. Um, and so I wanted to capture that. I didn't even know that that was that powerful when I wrote the book, but I wanted to capture that. So I was thinking as I wrote this chapter I'm about to read you, what would their emotions have been? Because they didn't grow up in a world like we did where they saw violence on their TV screens every single night. They didn't grow up in a world where they saw gratuitous violence at the theater. And yet he just saw this horrible assault. And my grandfather had been frantically looking for Turner. He did feel guilty that maybe he had caused him to be in danger because he tried to get him to be his informant. And so that both of these men are dealing with those emotions. So I'm going to read this for you. The chapter is called It Rattles a Man. And again, this is like an hour after the murder happened. And when I get to the part that my grandfather told me, I'll pause and let you know that. It Rattles a Man, chapter 22. I should have done more. That thought kept rolling around over and over in my head as I stood here in the dusty parking lot of the Sunset truck stop. I had seen Wallace and Civil outside the courthouse some 20 miles from here, and I had trusted that Sheriff Collier would question them and find out what was going on. My priority at that time, see, again, he's a revenue agent. His jurisdiction is not murder or assault. My priority at that time had been following up on a lead that Mark Anthony had given me. Chasing around after Wallace within Greenville city limits had not been my job or my jurisdiction. None of that mattered, however, as I stood here now, looking down at the combination of clay, sand, and what I suspected was Wilson Turner's blood. The spot was right next to the tire tracks of the assailant's car. This had to be the work of Wallace. It just had to be. One part I'm sorry, I didn't tell you about the midnight meeting. Before he got out of the car and all that other stuff happened, Wallace says, well, if you don't run him out of the state of Georgia, I'll kill him. He said, I went down, he was fishing in my pond the other day, and he said, I went down there to kill him. He said, I put my pistol in my pocket. I wasn't going to say nothing to him. I was just going to walk right up to him and shoot him in the head. And he said, but I got down there and he had his little boy with him, little 3-year-old. He said, I don't want to kill him in front of the little boy. So I just open my hand, let that pistol slide back down in my pocket. But my grandfather said, he said it just as matter of fact, as if he was talking about swatting a fly. So back to this. This had to be the work of Wallace. It just had to be. I had offered as much to Potts, but he wasn't ready to name suspects just yet. This investigation was still new to him. I had been pursuing John Wallace for a year. I had heard him threaten to kill Turner. I knew Wallace had done this. Potts and his brother, who was also his deputy, had questioned all the witnesses, including an elderly man from across the highway and a woman who lived 2 lots over from the diner, and gone back to their office. They were going to call the state crime lab to come and dust the truck for prints. They also asked Trooper Otwell, who was a friend of my grandfather's, if he would head back to Meriwether County. There were already reports coming in that assailants who, I'm going to skip that part. As for me, I walked over to an outdoor cooler, lifted a bottle of RC Cola, and popped the top in the installed opener. I would go in and pay before I left. I stepped over to an outdoor bench alongside the door of the diner and plopped down like a sack of flour. In this one day, I had appeared in court, Been awarded an automobile, which I had sold for nearly half a year's salary. I had an adrenaline rush from spotting Wallace and Sybil on the Greenville town square. I talked to Sheriff Collier, gotten an explosive tip, driven into the boondocks to end up in a fight with Punk and Woodley, which also really happened, rushed 2 children to the foundation for treatment, contemplated murder, heard from God, realized that the missing Turner had been right under my nose at the Greenville jail all this time, and then raced across the county line to discover he had been beaten. At the very least, I needed an RC and a minute or two to gather my wits. I pushed my Stetson back on my head, mopped my forehead with my handkerchief, and took a long draw off the cold bottle. Just then, Steve Smith, the owner of the diner and truck stop, let the screen door slap closed behind him. I reached in my pocket and flipped him a dime for the RC. He caught the coin in midair. He sat down on the bench beside me. Well, this situation has killed my business for the rest of the day, that's for sure. He looked at me and tried to manage a chuckle, but neither one of us was in a laughing mood. Your name's Miller, ain't it? Revenuer from over at Talbot County. I believe you've been in here to eat before. I have, I answered. Then, holding the pop in my left hand, I leaned over and shook his with my right. You kind of look like you're done in, he said. Do you know anything about all this? More than I care to, I said. I said no more, and he realized I wasn't going to share any information. What do you think of Potts? He asked. I've only worked with him a couple of times. He seems like a good lawman. Yeah, Smith said. Most folks around here think a lot of him. I drank some more RC. I was going to do something about Turner and Wallace. I just wasn't sure what. At the same time, I had the best tip I'd ever had on the location of the Upson County liquor gang still. We were quiet for a long time. Then Smith, staring blankly into the distance, spoke up. It rattles a man, he said. A man like you might get numb to it. A man in your business might get used to seeing things like what I saw today. I've never seen anything like it, I tell you. I wish I hadn't seen it still. I've seen some things, I said, but I ain't used to it. I hope to the Lord I never get used to it. Steve shook his head for a long time. He was doing what good people do in these situations. He was replaying it in his head. It would replay for a long time. It would never go fully away. It was an awful thing they'd done to that boy, he said. He fought. I tell you, he fought like a wild animal, but he wasn't no size. I wish now I'd done more, but I was so stunned I couldn't think. Yeah, I said. I know what you mean, wishing you'd done more. He didn't seem to notice what I'd said. That bald fellow, the one who claimed he was a guard from the Greenville jail, he was in a rage, man, a rage like I ain't never seen before. He wailed on that boy, first with a pistol, then Steve Smith, with his big, thick wrists and massive forearms resting on his apron, began to cry. He gathered himself again. Then he took a sawed-off shotgun that other white-haired man was holding. A big, bald-headed man and a man with white hair, I thought. That's Wallace and Sybil, all right. Smith went on with a story that I didn't want to hear, but that I had to hear. He took that shotgun and he came overhand with it like he was going to chop wood, and he brought them double barrels down on that boy's head. The boy was holding on to the sides of the opening of the car door, and he was screaming, man, I mean, he was screaming, somebody help me, help me. They're going to kill me, he says. Smith's voice broke again, and he wiped vigorously at his eyes with the corner of his apron. He had his feet up on the edge of the floorboard and was holding on with his hands on either side of the door, and they both couldn't get him in that car. But when he hit him with that shotgun, it went off, and Agent Miller, that boy went limp as a dish rag. I felt my throat start to burn. I grit my teeth. I suddenly saw Mrs. Turner all frantic in that kitchen of hers. She was still living in Wallace's sharecropper shack. Somebody would have to tell her what happened to her husband. Somebody was going to have to protect her. Steve was bent over, elbows resting on his knees. His head kept shaking from side to side slowly, trying to get his mind around what he had witnessed. I put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed. It'll be hard for you for a long time. You just have to go on with your daily work. Keep living your life. Stay busy. The busier you are, the less time you'll have to replay what's going on through your head right now. He looked over at me for a few seconds with what seemed to be relief and maybe appreciation in his eyes. I've got to go, I said. I'm not on this case, but I'm on another one that's related. I can work mine and maybe help find this boy, if he's alive. I stood up put my Stetson on firmly, and took a few steps towards my car. I heard Smith speak up again. I didn't turn to face him this time. His voice suddenly sounded like a lost child's. Agent Miller, that bald man, he jumped in the back seat on top of that boy. This is the part my grandfather told me. I didn't tell the sheriff this, and I don't know why. Maybe I was ashamed. But he jumped in on top of that boy, and the boy was all limp at the floor. The other man, the white-haired man, he ran around and drove out here screeching tires and all. And I looked up into that back window as they headed back to Meriwether County, and Agent Miller, that bald man had that boy pulled up by the hair of his head, and he just wouldn't stop beating him with that pistol. I never saw such rage in a man. I never saw such hate. He wailed on that poor limp boy all the way back up the road till I couldn't see him no more. He took a deep but ragged breath. He was trying not to sob. Something like that, Agent Miller, it rattles a man. I looked down the highway and toward the Meriwether County line. All this trouble had moved back there, across that imaginary line that bisected the pavement. It was a line I knew I had to cross, and trouble that I knew I would get in the middle of. It was late afternoon, and the heat waves were shimmering white hot off the pavement. Yeah, I said, I know what you mean. You can clap. But you see the emotion of Steve Smith and the emotion of my grandfather, because he did know he was going to get in the middle of that investigation. He felt a moral obligation to. Speaking of moral obligation, I want to tell you when I knew that I would someday write this book. I was 12 years old. We were watching the Andy Griffith Show. I was with my grandfather all summer that summer, and loved every minute of it. And my grandmother would make this huge Southern lunch. By the way, my grandmother thought it was a sin to serve loaf bread at a meal. If you didn't have homemade biscuits or homemade rolls or bread, you were just lazy. So we'd have biscuits and mashed potatoes and gravy and fried chicken, you name it. So we went into the den and we started watching the Andy Griffith Show. It came on in mid-afternoon on WTBS back then, Channel 17. And an episode came on with a character named Rafe Hollister. It was just actually on again the other day. Rafe Hollister was only on about 5 episodes, but in this episode he was making moonshine, and Andy was trying to catch him, and Otis was buying the moonshine. And my grandfather started squirming. He was in his 70s by then, so he'd been out of the revenue agent thing since the 50s. And he got really irritated, and he turned the TV off real abruptly. And I said, Pop, what's wrong? Aren't we going to finish the show? And I looked up, and he was crying. I'd never seen him cry. And he said, it wasn't like that, boy. There wasn't nothing funny about the moonshine business. He said, you think you've heard a little child cry? He said, wait till you drag their daddy out of some ditch somewhere, sick off of bad moonshine. He's messed in his pants. He's vomited all over himself. And you take him home to some shack. He said, you don't even know what poverty is. People in Georgia were so poor back then. By the way, the average annual farm income, yearly income for a farm in Georgia in 1941, this is a real number, $450. These people were breaking their backs for $450 a year. So if Daddy spent $20 a gallon of moonshine in 1941, this is also a real number, $20. So if he bought a gallon of moonshine, he just spent the grocery money for a month. So he said I would take him home. He'd be sick. Now he can't work for several days, and his little children will be running around out in the yard, half naked, crying because they're hungry. Their bellies distended from hunger. They haven't eaten all day, and now they're not going to eat tomorrow. And he said those little children would hold onto my leg and just wail and ask me to help them. And he said, and I couldn't help them all. I couldn't help them all. And he just started sobbing. And I said, I'm going to tell this man's story someday. Because we think moonshine is good old boys and the Dukes of Hazzard and all that stuff. And there were some of that. But there was also some very unscrupulous people. And the more the moonshine prices went up, moonshine prices skyrocketed during World War II because sugar was being rationed. So when the moonshine prices went up and there was more money to be made, then the violence went up and organized crime got involved. Phoenix City and Thomaston became huge red light districts with casinos and brothels. And my grandfather went undercover in Phoenix City. and I'm trying to learn more about that case. And so when the Bible Belt started seeing that level of crime in their communities, they wanted moonshine stopped. My grandfather wanted it stopped. That's what that moonshiner told me. He said, your grandfather was relentless. So when it all comes down to it, this is a story about the loss of innocence in Western Georgia, and also about calling. My grandfather felt a calling because he realized he had a skill set that could help shut down moonshine stills, and he shut down hundreds of them. In that same testimony, I don't think I've told you this yet, the DA said, now where was this still? He said, White Sulphur Springs. He says, now where was Wallace's bigger still? No, he didn't say Wallace. He said, where was the big still you also busted down there? And my grandfather said, which big still would you be referring to, sir? And he said, well, Agent Miller, just how many big stills have you busted in Meriwether County? And my grandfather says, oh, quite a high number, sir. So he was busting up moonshine stills left and right. And so it's a story about calling. And so I want to say just a few words about calling in your life. Everybody in here has a calling. Some of you already know what it is and you're already fulfilling yours. Mine is to be a writer. I'm a chemist. I was a chemist in power plants all my life, but that's how I pay the bills. My passion is writing, and writing stories has allowed me to connect with people all over America. I had a postcard from Saudi Arabia on my first book, The Rain, which is about Noah's Ark, and it said, your book helped me be a better man. And then it was signed with an Arabic name. I mean, you can't put a price on that. So in 2020, I had worked for the governor for 4 years, and then I got appointed by President Trump as his senior advisor on energy. So I got into office. I worked for about 5 weeks, and the president's speechwriting team called me. I was living in an apartment. My wife had not moved up yet. I was living in an apartment in D.C. with an air mattress and a lawn chair as my only furniture. And I was sitting there eating ramen noodles one night, and I get a call from the White House. Because at that time I was at DOE headquarters. I wasn't at the White House. And it was the chief speechwriter for the president. And he said, I need to write a speech for the president on energy. Would you help me? And I said, yeah, when do you need me to help? He said, right now. So I put my ramen noodles down and I helped write a speech for the president of the United States. So I got finished with that and I danced in my apartment around my lawn chair because I was like, this is my calling. This is the fulfillment of my whole life. I moved 44 times. I moved 20 times by the time I was 16. I was constantly the new kid. So I learned to tell kids stories. I learned to write stories as a coping mechanism. So God was preparing me as a writer way back then. So I write this speech. 2 weeks goes by. I don't know how it went. The White House calls me again. The president loved your speech. He wants you to come to the White House for breakfast. So now I'm really excited. And I think maybe he's going to appoint me as a speechwriter or on a speechwriting team because I had been the speechwriter for Governor Bevin in Kentucky. I never made it to the White House. 3 days before I was supposed to go to that breakfast, I passed out on a sidewalk in Washington, D.C. I didn't know I was sick. A bystander, a stranger, helped me up and got me to an emergency room, called an ambulance. I had to go through a series of tests and a series of doctors. I was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the deadliest form of leukemia in the world. They transferred me to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. The probably top oncology team in the world said, you only have a 2% chance of surviving. We cannot explain medically how you're even alive now. You have almost no red blood cells left. When the cancer hit me, it hit me like a freight train. So I was really macho about it when they first told me. I said, well, that's okay. I said, I'll beat it. I said, but listen, I got a breakfast at the White House in 2 days. I'm going to go do that, and then I'll come back and you can give me some pills or whatever. And the doctor grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me, and he said, Mr. Skates, you're not hearing what I'm saying. I cannot explain why you're alive now. We're not starting chemotherapy after your meeting at the White House. There will be no breakfast at the White House. We're starting chemotherapy in 12 hours. And he said, trying to defeat this disease will dominate the next year and a half of your life. And it did. So they gave me a 2% chance of survival. In 2020, 200 people got the type of leukemia that I had. 2 of us survived. I'm cancer free now. Yesterday, thank you. Yesterday I had breakfast at the White House. So I'm now able to fulfill my calling. But I told you that to say I had a 5-year in between there. Not only did I have cancer, it was during the pandemic. So I was trying to sell my house in Kentucky, and I couldn't work. I didn't have a salary. I had disability. So I was on 30% of my salary. I'm in Washington, D.C. I had to pay $2,500 a month for my apartment in D.C., $2,500 a month for an apartment in Baltimore for my bone marrow transplant. And I was making a $2,500 a month house payment in Kentucky. I took a bath on the house during the pandemic just to get rid of it. So I went bankrupt. So when I got, then President Biden got elected. We didn't actually really get along. So he didn't fire me actually, but I did resign. And by then I had gotten out of the hospital, but I was really weak. I had lost 95 pounds. My concentration wasn't great because of all my body had been through. I went through intense chemo. The oncologist said, I'm probably going to kill you with chemo. He said, I got to give you 3 chemo drugs at the same time in mass quantities. And he said, I'll probably kill you, but it's your only chance. Well, he didn't kill me. So I was weak. I wasn't focused mentally. And I ended up taking a much lower paying job back in Kentucky so I could be near my family. Miserable year to be locked down in the pandemic and going through chemotherapy and radiation. And so I got depressed. I was like, why did I think I could be a big shot and go write speeches for a president? Now I'm broke. I've lost, my wife doesn't have a home. We're living in a tiny apartment, which was roach infested. And then one day, a friend of mine who actually just got nominated for a federal judgeship had read the manuscript of Moonshine Over Georgia. It wasn't a book yet. I hadn't been able to get it published. And he said, Chris, I just want you to know I'm an attorney. I have to read constantly, but I finally got around to reading your manuscript for Moonshine Over Georgia. And Chris, I think it's the best book I've ever read in my life. And he said, you've got to get this published. He said, you can't give up. And he knew I had gotten depressed and given up. And that was a lifeline for me to just have somebody validate my writing. So I started trying again. It still took me another year and a half to get it published. But one of the people that had read one of my other books, my earlier titles in Washington, D.C., called me on New Year's Day of January 2023. She said the same thing. She said, I've read your manuscript of Moonshine Over Georgia, because by then she had become a friend of mine because she had read several of my books. She was the Undersecretary of the Interior for Ronald Reagan, and she's still a friend of mine. And she said, Chris, I'm retiring, and I want one of my retirement investments to be in you as an author. So I'm going to introduce you to the CEO of a publishing company, and we're going to get your book published. So that's why I have a book today. So I took this circuitous path thinking, okay, my calling's to write, but it wasn't easy. It's not like I met some guy, and there was one dude that had a book. He was trying to sell at Kroger. I don't even know who this guy was. He was in Seattle, Washington. And some TikTok influencer saw him, and he was like, oh, look at this poor slob. Nobody's buying his book. I don't know if the book's good or not, but I feel sorry for it. 35 million views. The guy's book was number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list the next day. And I'm like, where's my TikTok video? I had freaking cancer. Somebody could have taken a video of me with chemo going in the arm. But anyway, I got there. I've sold 4,000 or 5,000 copies. But again, I've connected with people all over the country. It's just the most rewarding thing in the world. I still got to work for the president for a living, but writing books is great. A lot of what I told you about my cancer story is in this other book, Showdown at the Beanstalk. That is a collection of short stories about my life, my 44 moves, a lot of the things that God has shown me through the years. I've done it. I've had an amazing life in a lot of ways. I was a professional cowboy on the biggest ranch east of the Mississippi River from the time I was 14 to the time I was 18. That's how my dad got me out of being sickly. He made me go work on that ranch. I didn't want to do it at first, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I've refueled a nuclear reactor. I've almost been killed by 2,000 psi steam. I've been shot at 4 times. So there's a lot of stories in that book, and they're all to help people that are going through a tough time, because the whole theme of the book is, hey, I went through some tough stuff. I made it. You're going to make it too. That's really what it's not. Oh, poor little me, this happened. It's not that at all. And a third of the book is humor. The reason for the title Showdown at the Beanstalk is when I was 5, I was obsessed with my grandfather and Matt Dillon. So I had a cap gun and a stick horse. And I got it in my head that the giant from Jack and the Beanstalk had invaded the woods behind our house. So I went after him with my 6-shooter. And that's the first story about how I tried to track down the giant. So both of those